Let me ask you something. What kind of man walks into a room like he owns it, smiles like nothing's wrong, and behind that smile carries a past so heavy it could shake an entire industry if it ever fully came to light? What kind of story starts at 11 years old, not with dreams of fame, but with moves that sound more like the opening scene of a crime documentary than the beginning of a music career? Because the truth is, everything you think you know about Pooh Shiesty might just be the surface, and beneath that surface is a timeline that doesn't add up, a pattern that refuses to be ignored, and a reputation that was built long before the spotlight ever found him. This isn't just about music. It's about a lifestyle that followed him into fame, a past that didn't stay in the past, and decisions that kept escalating even when the whole world was watching. And here's the part that should really make you stop and think. What if none of this was accidental? What if every move, every headline, every incident was part of a story that was always heading in the same direction? Because once you start connecting the dots, once you start looking beyond the fame and into the reality behind it, one thing becomes very clear. This isn't just another rapper controversy. This is something much bigger, something darker, and by the time we reach the end, you might start questioning everything you thought you knew. What most people fail to understand, and what rarely gets highlighted when this story is told in headlines and short clips, is that by the time the world started paying attention, the foundation had already been built in a completely different arena, one that does not operate on fame or followers, but on reputation and consistency. And that foundation is exactly what federal prosecutors later tried to reconstruct piece by piece when they stepped into the courtroom, because from their perspective, this was never about a single incident or a moment of bad judgment. It was about establishing a pattern that stretched back years, a pattern that showed intent, awareness, and repetition. And the deeper you go into that timeline, the more difficult it becomes to separate the public persona from the private reality. Because every stage of his life seems to connect in a way that feels less like coincidence and more like continuation. And it starts at an age where most people are still trying to figure out who they are, not defining themselves in ways that would later be used as evidence in a federal case. And yet that is exactly where this story begins, in an environment where the rules are different, where survival and status are tied to actions rather than words, and where the line between right and wrong is often blurred by circumstances that most people watching from the outside will never fully understand. And as those early years unfold, what stands out is not just the incidents themselves, but the consistency of behavior. The way certain choices keep repeating regardless of the consequences. And that is what makes the narrative so difficult to ignore once it is laid out in full. Because it suggests that the transition into music was not a departure from that life, but an extension of it. Another platform layered on top of an already established identity. And when you start looking at it from that angle, everything that happens later begins to make a different kind of sense. Not in a way that justifies it, but in a way that explains the trajectory. Because the same mindset that operates in one environment does not simply switch off when the setting changes. It adapts, it evolves, and it carries forward into whatever comes next. And in this case, what came next was access, visibility, and opportunity on a scale that most people never reach, and instead of creating distance from the past, it amplified it. Because now every move carried more weight, every decision had bigger consequences, and every action was being observed not just by the public but by agencies whose entire purpose is to track patterns and build cases over time. And that is where the story begins to shift from background noise to something much louder, because once those eyes are on you, every detail matters, every connection is noted, and every incident becomes part of a larger narrative that is slowly being assembled. And by the time that narrative is presented in a courtroom, it no longer looks like isolated moments, it looks like a sequence, a chain of events that all point in the same direction. And that direction is what ultimately turns a rising career into a case study of how quickly things can escalate when the past is not left behind but carried forward into the spotlight. And what makes it even more intense is the role of influence within that environment, because this is not a story of isolation. It is a story of proximity, of being raised around individuals who operated in a certain way, and understanding those operations from an early age, not as something distant, but as something normal, something integrated into everyday life. And when that becomes your baseline, your reference point for how things work, it shapes the way you move even when the circumstances change, and that influence does not disappear when success arrives. If anything, it becomes more pronounced because now there are more resources to act on it, more people involved, and more at stake. And that is exactly what prosecutors later emphasized when they tried to connect the dots, arguing that this was not about a sudden shift or a momentary lapse, but about a consistent approach to decision-making that had been present for years. and whether or not you agree with that interpretation, the fact remains that the evidence they presented was built on continuity, on the idea that the same behaviors kept resurfacing regardless of the consequences. And that is what makes the first phase of this story so critical, because it sets the tone for everything that follows. It establishes the baseline that the rest of the narrative builds on, and once you understand that baseline, once you see how early it was formed and how consistently it was reinforced, it becomes much easier to understand why the later events unfolded the way they did, because by then it was no longer about learning new patterns. It was about repeating old ones in a new environment where the stakes were infinitely higher, and once that baseline is locked in, once that pattern becomes second nature, the next phase does not arrive as a sudden change. It arrives as an escalation, because now the environment is bigger, the access is wider, and the consequences are no longer local. They start crossing state lines, attracting attention from systems that do not forget and do not lose interest once they start watching. And this is where the story begins to shift from background history into active investigation. Because as the music starts gaining traction, and the public image begins to grow, something else is happening at the same time. Something quieter but far more dangerous. A collection of incidents, movements, and connections that are being documented in real time. And the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Because on one side, you have rising success, chart placements, industry recognition. And on the other side, you have situations that continue to mirror the same behaviors that were present long before the spotlight. And that duality is exactly what draws attention. Because it raises a question that investigators are trained to ask: how does someone with everything to lose continue to move like they have nothing to lose at all? And that question is what drives deeper scrutiny. Because it suggests that the motivation is not circumstantial, it is embedded. And as more incidents begin to surface, the narrative starts to take shape. Not in public yet, not in headlines, but in files, reports, and internal discussions that are slowly building towards something much bigger. And this is where anonymous sources start to appear. Individuals who claim to have seen things firsthand, who describe operations that go beyond what is visible to the public, talking about coordination, about planning, about movements that are too precise to be random, and whether every detail they provide is accurate or not. The overall picture they contribute to is one of structure, not chaos. And that distinction matters, because chaos can be dismissed as coincidence, but structure implies intent, and intent is what turns suspicion into a case. And as that case begins to form, every new incident is no longer evaluated on its own. It is compared against everything that came before it, looking for similarities, looking for patterns, looking for confirmation that the narrative being built is not just plausible but provable. And at the same time, the public is reacting in a completely different way, because from the outside it looks like controversy, like headlines that come and go, like moments that trend and then disappear. And that disconnect between public perception and investigative reality is what allows things to continue longer than they normally would. Because while fans debate and speculate, the documentation continues quietly in the background, growing stronger with each edition. And then there is the role of social media, which in this story becomes almost a character of its own, because instead of distancing actions from exposure, it amplifies them, turning private moments into public displays. And that creates a situation where the line between evidence and expression starts to blur, because what is being shared for attention or validation can also be interpreted in a completely different context by those who are watching with a different objective. And that objective is not entertainment, it is confirmation. And every post, every caption, every appearance becomes another piece to analyze, another detail to place within the larger framework that is being constructed, and this is where the tension really begins to build. Because now it is not just about what is happening, it is about how it is being recorded, how it is being perceived, and how it is being used. And as the gap between those perspectives widens, the risk increases, because actions that might seem insignificant in the moment can take on a completely different meaning when viewed as part of a pattern. And that is exactly what starts to happen as the timeline progresses, because the incidents do not stop. They evolve, they become more complex, more visible, and more difficult to dismiss. And with each new development, the pressure builds. Not just publicly, but legally. Because once a pattern is established, the threshold for action lowers and the tolerance for repetition disappears. And that is the stage where everything becomes critical, where one more move, one more incident, one more connection can shift the entire situation from observation to intervention. And by the time that shift happens, it rarely comes as a surprise to those who have been paying attention behind the scenes, because for them, the story has already been unfolding in slow motion, every piece falling into place exactly where it was expected to, and when that moment finally arrives, when the narrative that has been building quietly is brought into the open. It does not feel sudden, it feels inevitable, like the conclusion of something that was always heading in the same direction from the very beginning. And when that inevitability finally catches up, it does not arrive quietly or gradually. It hits all at once, like every piece that had been building in the background suddenly snapping into place at the exact same moment. And this is where the story stops being speculation, stops being whispers and theories, and becomes something official, something documented, something that carries consequences that cannot be talked away or ignored. Because once the shift happens, from observation to action, everything changes. The same moves that once existed in separate moments are now connected. The same incidents that once felt isolated are now presented as part of a single narrative. And that narrative is what defines everything moving forward, because it is no longer about proving one event, it is about proving a pattern. And once that pattern is established in a legal context, it becomes incredibly difficult to break because every argument, every defense, every explanation has to work against not just one accusation, but an entire timeline that has been carefully assembled. And this is where the weight of everything begins to show. Because the spotlight that once amplified success now amplifies scrutiny. Every detail is examined, every connection is questioned, and every decision is placed under a microscope that does not miss anything. And the pressure that comes with that is something very few people are prepared for, especially when the same instincts that guided earlier choices are still in play, because those instincts do not adjust to the new reality. They continue operating the same way, even when the stakes have changed completely, and that is what creates the final layer of tension in this story. The clash between an environment that demands caution and a mindset that has been built on something entirely different. And as that clash unfolds, the consequences become unavoidable, not just for one individual, but for everyone connected to the situation. Because when a case reaches this level, it does not stop at a single name. It expands. It pulls in associates. It examines relationships. It traces movements across time and place. And suddenly what once looked like a circle of collaboration starts to look like something else entirely when viewed through a legal lens. And that transformation is what turns a personal story into a collective one, where multiple lives, multiple futures, and multiple outcomes are now tied together by the same chain of events. And as the process moves forward, the reality begins to settle in that this is no longer about image or perception, it is about outcomes that carry real weight, outcomes that can redefine everything that came before them. And that is where the full impact of the story becomes clear. Because when you step back and look at the entire timeline from beginning to end, from the earliest moments that set the pattern to the final stages where that pattern is confronted, it becomes impossible to ignore how consistent it has been, how every phase has echoed the one before it, and how every opportunity to change direction was met with the same response, the same continuation of what had already been established. And that is what makes this story so difficult to look away from, because it forces a question that does not have an easy answer. A question about how much of a person's path is shaped by where they come from and how much is defined by the choices they make along the way. And in this case, those two forces seem to be intertwined so tightly that separating them becomes almost impossible, because the environment created the foundation, but the repetition reinforced it. And by the time the consequences arrived, both were working together in a way that left very little room for anything else. And that is the reality that now sits at the center of everything, a reality where the past is no longer just history, it is evidence. Where the present is no longer just a moment, it is a turning point, and where the future is no longer uncertain in the way it once was, it is defined by the outcome of everything that has come before it. And as that outcome continues to unfold, one thing remains clear above everything else, that this was never just a story about rise and fall, it was a story about a pattern that never broke, a trajectory that never changed, and a series of decisions that ultimately led exactly where they were always heading. If this story shocked you, hit like and tell me in the comments what part surprised you the most. Subscribe now because the real stories the media hides are just getting started.